Hello, and welcome to the BLC podcast, a ministry of Bethlehem Lutheran Church, ELCA, St. Cloud, Minnesota. On this episode, we're asking the question, can science and faith coexist? To help us do this is somebody who not only has a deep faith, but also has a deep love for the sciences. A member of Bethlehem, Charles Miller has been teaching physics and astronomy at St. John's Prep for over 20 years. He not only has a love for science, but as you'll hear, he carries a deep faith with him as well. It seems that faith and science can exist. So join us on this episode as we dive into our faith and find out how science can have a place at the table too. Thanks for listening. The Lord be with you. And we're back. Another episode here of the BLC podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. Today we have a special guest on our episode here. I'm going to introduce Chad, and then Chad will introduce our special guest for today.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So we are back with another topic, a 21st century church faith and science kind of conversation because, hey, it's right around Easter time. You might have actually listened to this after Easter. So there's all this conversation about, the supernatural miracles. A lot of people these days asking questions about, is it even possible to have faith and have an academic mindset? And so, today, we have with us Charles Miller. Charles, can you introduce yourself for the people who do not know you?
Sure. I've been a member of Bethlehem for over 20 years. I am a lifelong science teacher, raised by a lifelong science teacher. My dad's a professor of genetics, and I teach high school physics and have taught all the different sciences from basically 6 through 12. And the entire time, believe it or not, I have been Lutheran.
The entire time?
Yeah, the whole time I've been teaching all those science classes.
And you've been a Lutheran teaching in a Catholic school.
Also true. Yeah, and I was kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing through a program at Notre Dame as well, where it was basically teaching about the intersection of faith and science. And I think I was the only non-Catholic in the entire program, but they welcomed me with open arms, and I learned a lot.
That's really awesome. And, the other thing, though, just to kind of, round out your introduction here, is it right? You also are a coach for, I don't even know how to say this, computer sports? Is that... What's the technical term for this?
Yeah, esports is the term we use for it. Yeah, and I've been a coach my whole teaching career as well. I started in basketball, and then I coached tennis. Then I started coaching Knowledge Bowl, and Prep won a few state tournaments in Knowledge Bowl. And then a student came to me and asked to introduce esports at Prep. I didn't know. I'm not going to lie, I didn't know it was a thing at that time either. And I said, well, if we can do that, I'll coach it. And I did, and they've done great. And we just last month won our first state championship in esports. So that was great.
Oh, that is so foreign to me. Matt, were you a big video game person growing up?
Maybe just a little bit, yeah.
Were you really? So I don't know. I don't think I would have succeeded if they had that back when I was growing up, because we got our Nintendo taken away from us so often because I'd get so angry and I'd throw my controller on the ground, and I think I broke several of them that way.
I literally remember my dad turning off the Nintendo on Sunday morning because it was time to go to church. I remember doing that.
So Charles, I am so curious because we're off on a little tangent here, and that's okay. But do you have any of these hardcore computer gamers who just can't stand losing, or how does this work?
I think every hardcore gamer can't stand losing. I think that's part of being good at, I know a lot of basketball players that can't stand losing as well. So esports is just an outlet for kids to be a team, and our games that we play at Prep are team games. And so, yeah, I've broken up near fist fights. I have had students throw their mouse, storm out of the room, and never come back to the team, just like I had kids storm off the basketball court or the tennis court as well. Although I will say I only broke up one fight in all the years of coaching Knowledge Bowl. It was a lot less common in there, but even in there, when things would get hot and people get mad and they'd get upset with each other, they're still adolescents competing hard, which is, honestly, it makes me happy when I see anger or tears for the right reasons. It's how you express it that we got to work on, not that you're showing emotion, because that means you're passionate about what you're doing, which I love as a coach.
Yeah. It seems like the same things you can learn from a team sport of any kind. You learn doing that as well.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Okay, so I got us off there a little bit on this tangent, but that's okay, because let's get it back here to the conversation that I really want to have with you. And I kind of have a way I want to introduce this because, well, and again, just jumping back here. So there's this idea out there that it is, for many people, it is becoming harder and harder to be a person who has faith and spirituality and at the same time not check your brain at the door. And I have conversations about this with people on a fairly regular basis. And it's interesting to me because they'll ask questions like, well, do I have to believe all this stuff in order to be a part of the faith community? Like, and what if I don't? And what if I don't buy this? And what if... It's really interesting to have these conversations. But here's how I want to kick off our time together here around this topic. So I got a quiz for each of you. And it's for both of you. I didn't tell you about it because that's good, because I didn't want you to think about this too much ahead of time. But here's my question. Which group of people are more engaged, that is, attend religious services and ministries the most? Is it those with less than a high school degree or a diploma? Is it those with a high school diploma, those with a 4-year degree, or those with a graduate school degree? Of those levels of education, which group attends, participates, engages in faith communities the most? What do you think?
You want to go first, or you want me?
No, Matt, I want you to go first.
I'm going to go with the least educated people are probably the ones going to church going, give me some Jesus. That's just my guess.
Charles, what do you think?
I feel like my sample is biased, but I'm gonna say the same thing as Matt. I really feel like people get more as they start to question more. They become more of a part of a peer group that judges their answers to questions.
Okay. So you would both be incredibly surprised to learn then that actually the reverse is true. Really? That those with the highest levels of education in our country are the ones most engaged.
Wow.
Now, that being said, fewer and fewer and fewer people are part of religious and faith communities now, but of the current makeup, according to a lot of the data and statistical research that I nerd out on, it is the most highly educated, and I was surprised too, because that doesn't seem right. And yet, even though that's the case, there are still all kinds of people who are asking this question, though. Can I have faith and still be a person with integrity, a person with reason, a person who really values, the scientific method and education and all of that kind of stuff? And so here's my piece on this. And I think one of the things that I want to talk about today is this idea between secularization, which moves us from a enchanted worldview to like a disenchanted worldview. And so, like, once upon a time, like when people got sick, people called in all manner of people to help, cast out the evil that was in this person, causing this sickness. They didn't have an understanding of what was going on. There was the idea that spirits were out in the world. It was a dangerous place, and by God, you better have some religious person praying for you, because it was a seriously scary place to be in our world. And as we've gotten to know more and more and more things, a lot of that enchantment has gone away. And now people are living in this disenchanted world where my loved one didn't die from demonic affliction. They died from cancer. Cancer is a natural process, and there's nothing spiritual about this at all. And people really do struggle with this idea of, how do I make sense of God in a world that really doesn't make room for God much anymore? Or does it? I guess, and so Charles, I'm really curious from your perspective, from a person who just has been teaching science your entire life to a lot of different kids, from a person who has had some continuing education and experiences through Notre Dame, how do you make sense of this? Like, what would you tell people? Like, do you have to check your brain at the door? Can you be a person that has a deep faith in spirituality while maintaining the integrity of the academics? How would you even begin to talk about this?
Ooh, that's a big topic.
It is. It's huge.
So
how do you want to break it down?
Yeah, so my friend Eric Yank and I, who went through this program together, started a class actually at St. John's Prep that we call Faith, Science, and Reason. And we tackle those kinds of topics over the course of a whole semester, one chunk at a time, right? But just to get at the demonic possession part you mentioned, we do discuss this notion that really you could trace it back to the Enlightenment, but Isaac Newton, who I dearly love as a physics teacher, is partially accidentally to blame for introducing this idea of God of the gaps. So we've got God here doing the things that science can't explain. And then the problem with that is you box God into stuff that science can't explain. And over the course of the last 400 years, we've been boxing that space smaller and smaller and smaller. And so it's led to this incorrect notion, in my opinion, that God is there to explain things that science can't. So once science can explain it all, we no longer need God. And that God is there. And it sort of has led to a little bit of a, God is the source of things we can't understand. So it must be the source of ignorance. And maybe that's a little bit feeding right into the bias of the quiz that Matt and I got wrong, that, well, obviously we associate deeply religious with less educated. Whereas, I said my sample size is biased because in my experience, I walk around campus with monks with PhDs, that have been devoting their lives to chemistry and God.
Yeah.
And so that to me is my world that I see God in, right? Is not the God of the gaps that science can't explain, but the underlying, like Thomas Aquinas said, the underlying cause of the causes, right? The underlying reason that all these other things can happen. But one of the chapters that honestly is the hardest for both of us to co-teach is why does God let it happen then?
Right.
Like the concept that if God works miracles, where's my miracle? Where's the miracle for cancer? We could understand the demon just couldn't quite get dispossessed, but if this is a natural thing, why didn't God just stop it? And that could be a real tough topic to tie in with this whole notion.
Right. And actually that really ties into so you have the topic of sickness and why does God let it happen? But it's really also the question of evil, right? Or why do bad things happen in general? Epicurus and this trilemma that he came up with a long time ago on this idea of evil, that how do we explain evil in our world, if there is a God? Because if God is good and then there is evil, that must mean that God is not powerful because evil exists. And if God was powerful and evil exists, then that means God must not be good, because why would a good God who is powerful allow evil to happen? So if God is both good and powerful, then why do we have so much suffering in this world? And that's a trilemma.
This topic was tackled at the end of the newest Batman versus Superman movie. The villain guy, what's his name, said exactly what you just said, talking about Superman. And he said that exact quote. I just remembered that.
No, that's good. I like that, Matt. Thank you for bringing pop culture back into this very, very, very old conversation.
Kind of using Superman as the God figure in that.
So, that goes right along, though, with what you were saying, Charles, though, I think, right?
Yeah, that it's a really hard one for students to wrap their heads around, and for adults. I think a lot of people, I've met several people who had a crisis of faith. Why would God let this happen? And I come back to that God has allowed suffering. God hasn't caused suffering. God has allowed free will. God could have created whatever God wanted. So why did God create a world where there are earthquakes? Because earthquakes are, from one perspective, bad, but from another perspective, good. And in our perspective, we say, my uncle died in that earthquake. That's terrible. But if there hadn't been earthquakes, we'd be underwater. Right. Cancer is terrible, but cancer comes from mutations. And if there hadn't been mutations, there wouldn't be humans. So I like to believe as a Christian scientist, not a Christian scientist, but a Christian who's a scientist, I like to believe that we're moving towards the perfection of God's creation without cancer, without suffering. But the fact that we have a world that is revealing its God's creation, and it takes time for that to happen, and we have a role in it, and our free will, that's kind of an inevitable byproduct. You know, sometimes if you're going to drive a car, you're going to get a flat tire. The world just works out that way. And you know, if God had created it so that there was never any suffering, then there would be no free will. There'd be no, we'd be automatons doing exactly what we're supposed to do according to God's plan.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea even that, you know, God's creation continues, is not done yet. It continues to create. It continues to move forward. It continues to progress. Yeah, there's all kinds of theological conversation around this. And it's been helpful for me over the years, but at the same time, like if you are a person who's looking for solid certainty, you're not going to find that. I mean, that is one of the things that I think for some people in religion they search for, and then when they figure out that they can't get it, then they don't know what to do. So, Charles, I'm also... Oh, go ahead.
You know what's funny about that is that's where people say, well, let's turn to math and science because we want certainty. And I find it really interesting that, you know, science is constantly changing its mind about the world as we discover more evidence, we get better tools. But even beyond that, science at its heart is based on faith. And this is the part I start every one of my science classes explaining to students, because we are going to work in science from two assumptions that are inherently unprovable. That the world will behave in a predictable manner. That when I wake up tomorrow, the rules that applied today are still going to apply tomorrow. And we have no proof of that. We just have faith that it will continue to act that way. So what I'm doing has meaning. And then number two, that the important things we're trying to investigate are even knowable. That our brains are enough to actually understand the rules. Like I think of like a dog watching baseball. Like, does the dog really know all the stuff that's going on? Maybe, maybe not. I don't have a way to tell, but I'm guessing not really.
He knows there's a ball and that he really wants it.
Yep, and that might be how we are with quantum mechanics. Right. That we're just watching this like a dog watching a baseball game going, man, this would be fun to chase. But we are assuming, we are using our faith statement that we believe we can understand the universe and that it's predictable. And so people who say, well, science is based on, you know, predictability and facts, I feel like it's also based in faith. And that if you look to science to solve all the answers, eventually you also end up with some real big problems in your life.
I've heard one guy say that the search for deeper science, the search for knowledge, is actually the search for God.
I mean, yeah. I mean, again, for me, there's never been an issue whatsoever with faith science, the intellectual side of life. In fact, I can't imagine having a faith that would require me to abandon that. I don't think I could have a faith that required, me to check my brain at the door because yes, this is such a big question. And I mean, again, I go back to this idea, like in our last podcast, I kind of did the 4 stages of Brian McLaren's, take on faith development. And we don't move forward without asking questions. And I think, okay, so here we go. Charles, you're a lifelong Lutheran. Here
Correct.
We go. Just humor me here for a little bit. So going back to your, I'm going to assume middle school years, doing confirmation. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm curious, at the end of confirmation, what was that experience like for you? What were you required to do for confirmation?
Well, okay, that's a really funny story that we probably don't want to get too deep into, because I actually had an argument with my mom just last month that I didn't think I had been confirmed.
Oh.
And then she pulled out the picture of me in my confirmation robe, and I was like, okay, I don't have any memory of that. And I do know that at that point, my dad was an empiricist, not a Catholic as he is today. And I also kind of took on I'll do this if I need to. And I went to Lutheran services, but actually, to be honest with you, always at the core, that whole entire time I would pray, and I knew God was listening, and I believed what I had taught. But the only thing I have memory of from what apparently was confirmation is memorizing things that I needed to know for the test, quote unquote.
Right.
That I don't have like when my kids went through confirmation here, I remember the conversations and the struggles. But when I remember it from back my early days, it was the memorizing of the facts and figures that I needed to pass the test.
Of course it was. And maybe you can't remember because it was so traumatic that you blocked it out of your mind. But I asked that question because back in that method of teaching faith formation, even back when like I went through confirmation, I mean, they brought out Luther's Small Catechism. If you're Lutheran, you might know what that is. And we had to memorize things from it. And there was always this line that after, you recited either whether it was a creed or the Lord's Prayer or whatever you had to memorize out of that small catechism, Luther wrote this question of what does this mean? And here's what's funny, and here's why I bring this up. For so many generations of people, that question sounded like this. What does this mean? Like angry, like get the answer right. Memorize this. Recite it verbatim. You need to have this locked in. And you were graded on this. You were tested on this. Some people talk about having to get up in front of people and do that from memory in front of a crowd, and that was terrifying for them, and they hated it, and it was so horrible. And the irony to all of that is that when this was being developed, when faith formation, Luther's catechism back in the day was being brought forward, it wasn't, what does this mean? Angry question. It was like a kid who is curious about the world. It was questions. What does this mean? Like, why is the sky blue? Why does this happen? Why is this flower red and this one's white? Why? I mean, it was the question that drove faith formation that we then took and made into this really hard, concrete, black and white kind of thing, and forgot that if you are going to have a relationship with anything, whether that's another person, whether that's God, whether that's the earth itself, questions are at the core.
Right, yeah.
So I am curious, if you, shifting just a little bit here, Charles, so for the students that you teach who are growing up in this, and again, I call it, I use other people's language, but the disenchanted world where we don't look out and naturally see the divine at work, or at least it's not as customary as it used to be. Let me just give an example of this, I guess, again. Back in the day in the enchanted world, people would go to Mass, and it was funny. There came this issue in Europe where the priests had to crack down on this because the peasants, the commoners, were taking the host, the bread from Eucharist, and they were taking it back to their farm, and they were planting it in the ground with their crops because they knew it had power. And they knew that this power of God would then make their crops succeed, and it would take the worms out of their cabbage and all of that kind of stuff. And so they had to crack down on this because the world was this enchanted world where the power of God made evident in the Eucharist, in this bread, was so important that they took it with them, that they hid it in their mouth actually and took it out of the church. That is not the world we live in anymore. It just isn't. And when you have students, as you're teaching in a Catholic setting, and again, I know all students go there, but as you're putting together this faith and science piece, these kids are growing up very much in a disenchanted world. What do you, what has your experience been as you try to introduce this topic to them? Is there a lot of reception to that, or is it very hard for people to grasp this notion?
Great question. I have found that we do get students of all faiths, and probably the most common is none of the above. Even, I guess most common would be Catholic, but very close behind is none of the above, and we're less than half or right around half students are Catholic. So how do we introduce a class that we know will have only, a quarter of it be believing Catholics that is going to talk about faith and science? We start with awe, because the world is still amazing and beautiful, and kids don't get enough of an opportunity. So we walk out on the trail in Lake Sagatagan and we look out at the water and the chapel, and we just take a moment to reflect on how beautiful the world can be, because that's part of, to me, what's missing when you divide out faith and science is you don't get to really embrace the awe as deep down and fundamentally. To me anyway, the part that's always stuck in my craw when I try to think about how I could live without an idea of God is like, so look at this beautiful creation that came about by random luck. Boy, I'm glad that worked out. That's not a world I want to live in. And I honestly feel like that's what I'm seeing in schools these days too, is kids that have a crisis of faith. When they hit those hard points, they feel so alone, even when they've got social media all around them and parents that love them and that kind of stuff. But if you really believe in your soul that there's a meaning to the fabric of the universe that you're investigating, like all of these scientists that I teach about, many of them up until the 20th century, that you are exactly right. They were searching for God. Kepler, for my favorite example, who discovered the orbit of the planets, he was trying to see the mind of God by looking to the stars, right? So when you look out at creation and you go, wow, that's really beautiful, and you know that there's an underlying meaning to the fabric, it gives you hope at times when things are hopeless in a way that I feel like is so missing. And I would like to point out, you said this earlier too, the problem is the divide between faith and religion has come from both sides, right? Living most of my life in the Lutheran and Catholic worlds, I haven't felt it as much. But when I've taught in public schools, for example, and had parents that believed in the literal translation of the Bible, they would get really upset with me if I said something as a scientist that deviated from that. And that would fight from the science side and create a divide. And then if you go back to the history of the science side, there were a couple of guys that were really important in the 1800s that intentionally wrote books called like Warfare and Battle between science and religion, with the intent of trying to discredit either Catholics or faith in general around the 1860s, 70s. Draper and White were their names. And that got adopted by the public culture. Oh, there's a war. That's right. I've heard about Galileo got locked up by the church. Give me another example. Like, it's always Galileo that people will pull out as we know that, as opposed to the hundreds and hundreds of scientists who are also people of faith, right? So that war that seems to be having built up over the last 100 years, it's really the extremes, if this sounds familiar in our current environment, it's really the extremes from the two sides casting rocks across the middle, where in the middle is a whole lot of people who are just trying to make sense of the world around them. And when you don't try to use science to test faith, and you don't try to use faith to claim that the world can't be turning because it says so in the Bible or whatever, if you don't set those two extremes up, it makes a much more beautiful picture for kids, I think.
Well, it does. And I mean, is part of the gift, I think, that, and again, just a plug for Bethlehem, like churches that find themselves really in that mainline tradition of this academic tradition, we have forever, talked about the historical critical side of looking at the biblical story. There's a context, both historically and literary. Genesis is not a science book. It is written as the creation stories are Hebrew poetry, for crying out loud.
Was Moses a flat earther?
Right? We make these arguments. The idea that the biblical story is quote unquote inerrant, meaning that it is infallible in both its history and the science behind it, that is a very, very, very modern understanding of the biblical story as a whole. And it does nothing but set you up for these fights. And you either have to, again, at this point, check your brain at the door and say, okay, I'm all in on this faith side, or you have to say, I can't have any part of religion in my life. I am purely an intellectual, purely a science, quote unquote, science-driven person. I don't think it's not either or. I mean, it never has been, but it seems like it.
And my favorite example of that actually came when we were looking at the St. John's Bible as part of our class, which, by the way, I'll throw out a plug for St. John's on that one because it's beautifully interwoven science and faith all throughout that thing. And if you can go out and see it on campus, it's just stunning artwork. And Genesis, the creation story, has all of the scientific imagery in it. But my favorite thing that was brought up, I don't know if I just never thought of this before, but on the first day, but there's no light. So how do you have a day? What is a day without light? Like, what does that even mean? And so people trying to claim, no, it's exactly 6 days. Now, there was no earth and there was no sun and nothing was turning, but, a day has got to be a literal, like the whole thing obviously just crumbles if you come at it from a thoughtful perspective from either direction.
Well, it crumbles even if you just ask people to, okay, let's look at the creation story in Genesis 1. Now look at the creation story in Genesis 2. Now tell me what order they appear in. Oh, they're different. Oh my gosh, we already have an issue. I mean, it's a lot of people do want to make those kind of comparisons and say, see, you can't, be one or the other. And I think this is a really important conversation because I like what you said earlier, Charles. There's a lot of people who feel isolated, who experience life, go into a crisis, and are not sure what community can support them, feeling that they have no community to support them, feeling that there's nothing deeper, more meaningful behind life other than just existence. And I think this is where congregations, church, faith communities have an opportunity to really still be valuable in a 21st century context. Because I don't know what other community you're really going to find that can help people navigate this and walk with intentionality as they go through life and support one another in community, as you find in a lot of congregations that are, by the very nature of their existence, these intergenerational places that bring people together and have this hope-filled message. Not a message that requires you to not ask questions, not a message that requires you to check your brain at the door, not a message that makes it impossible for you to be a part of the community if you don't buy everything that they're selling, so to speak. And I think that's still a gift that's not yet realized by everybody as they have all these other experiences. So, Charles, I think we're kind of coming close to the end of the conversation, but anything else that you want to bring up as far as this idea behind faith, science, religion, how they go together, how they play off each other, how they can be supporting one another, and how people can go have actually a deeper faith experience as they grow deeper into their own intellectual knowledge. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, actually, I have two quick things that pop into my head for how to put them together in harmony. The first one, C.S. Lewis, famous for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? He wrote one of my favorite things I've ever read on the topic. It was called Meditation in a Tool Shed. And it's just a couple pages long, but what he describes is, imagine you're in a tool shed and you see this beam of light coming through a hole, and it's lighting up the dust. And you see this beautiful beam of light coming down and striking the floor. But then you lean down and you look up through the beam of light and you see the dazzling sun. And his point is, which is the right view? Which one is the beam of light? Is it the beam that you look at from the side or the beam that you look along? And his analogy there is, this is what faith and science basically, he doesn't say it this way, but this is what faith and science do. Science lets us look at things. So you see a teenager falling in love for the first time. You could say, this is just a rush of hormones that comes about because of a biological urge for the procreation of the species. That's looking at this. But if you're the teenager in love, it's a deep and meaningful thing and part of your life because you're looking along this experience, right? And God is the along that can help any. It's a perspective that you're just not. I don't feel you're fully engaging with the world if you never get this view of along and everything is just an at. Everything's just a set of mechanisms that we're trying to understand better, and that there's no such thing as the dazzling light of the sun. Which I really liked. And then the other one is actually a quote from John Paul II that I have on our syllabus and is in the front of our textbook that we use in this class. It says, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world in which both can flourish." And I think that's Science has a lot to offer theology to understand how to interpret what God wants us to do with the world. If we didn't have science and we never understood climate change, for example, we might not be able to be people who take care of our environment the way God would want us to. We need science to help us understand how to apply our theology. But similarly, we need theology to know, is it okay to do this thing? And science might be able to tell us what's happening, but is science ever going to be able to tell us why it's happening, or what's the purpose of our lives and what's the good of doing the science? I think for that, we will always need God.
I agree. I think that's so important for people to hear, because I do know from conversation that there are a lot of people who struggle, not necessarily themselves with this topic, but they have family members who do, or they have kids who do, or their kids say to them, I could never go back to being in a faith community because, and then they list these different reasons, and one of them is this anti-intellectual kind of viewpoint. And that really does come out of a lot of the conservative religious groups that operate in the country right now. And we, using this just generic we, get painted with that same brush. And so I think it's really important to have these kind of conversations to be able to offer people the chance to hear how faith and science are robust, that they work with each other, and that you can be both a person of great spirituality and faith and a person of great intellect and science. Just what you reminded me, Charles, too, of this again, systematic theology kind of idea that the finite cannot contain the infinite. I mean, we are part of this created order, and we are always striving to go deeper and to know more, never fully understanding, but always asking the questions. And I think that's just, again, that's what we try to do in our faith formation. That's what we try to do in our services, and invite people along for the ride.
You also reminded me of a quote that was not intended to be faith and science, but now, in light of what you just said, I see it that way. When you're having these conflicts with people, because I get it from both sides, from people who think I'm too science or think I'm too theology. You can't fight darkness with darkness, only with light, and you can't fight hate with more hate. Only love will drive out hate. I think that's a science and theology, science and faith combination right there.
There we go. Well, Charles, thanks for being here with us today. This was fun. I appreciate your perspective, your expertise on the matter, and you're just a fun guy to talk to.
Oh, thanks.
Matt, closing comments?
So just to wrap up, were dinosaurs on the Earth, right?
I'm on board with that.
Okay, good. Because I got some favorite dinosaurs I'm going through with my buddy Wally, my son. And I want to make sure that, I can tell him that God made dinosaurs.
But Matt, you do, I heard that the new idea behind dinosaurs is that they had feathers. Do your dinosaurs that you play with Wally with have feathers?
Sometimes, yeah. We've gone through that, yeah. We talked about the birds and everything and all that stuff. So that's where I'm at. That's where my head's at, dinosaurs.
Good deal, Matt.
Okay. Nope. So, yeah, this has been a great episode. I've really enjoyed. Thank you for being here. I've actually really enjoyed just taking a back seat and just kind of listening. And, yeah. So where do we go from here? I guess we just say thank you for listening. If you have any comments or questions about the episodes or any other topics that you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to just reach out. You can find my email at mmetz at BethlehemLutheran.org, or you can reach out to Chad at C. Peterson. That's Peterson with an O at the end, S-O-N, at BethlehemLutheran.org. We'll be happy to hear your thoughts, your suggestions, and what you thought of the episode. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.